Hey there, guys. It's lovely to be with you again, and hope you don't feel you're getting too much of me at the moment. But I enjoy being with you on Sunday, and I'm privileged to be part of this little journey with you through January, thinking about joy, but thinking about it especially in terms of joy in darker times, rather than just in the more positive, happy, upbeat parts of life. I'd like to begin by playing you a song. It's by Luke Sital Singh. I don't know if you know Luke. His music has certainly been gaining greater exposure in recent times. His music really emerged when he was a part of St Luke's Church, where I was the vicar up until a couple of years ago, and it was just a great sort of pleasure to see Luke's talent blossoming and emerging whilst he was with us in that time. And uh, and he, he he produced a song called Dark, which is actually based on some lyric. The lyrics are based on a poem by Martin Rowe, who was one of my colleagues in St Luke's, a great talented writer himself. And I love this poem. I love the song that Luke has produced. Um, and I hope you like it too. I'm going to play it for you. And Luke's got a very sort of recognizable, specific kind of voice. It's a very mournful voice, but I think it's a very beautiful voice. So I hope you enjoy it. Here you go.
You are the deepening mystery. When life is full of simplicity, you are the nagging doubt, the hideaway doubt. When everyone believes, everyone believes. You are the abstract art of pain and poem. When our propaganda makes everything clear, you are the thirsty throat, the desert defeat. When there's water everywhere, you are dark. You are dark. You are dark. When all is bright, you are the silence, the God gone missing. When the din of all belief is deafening, you are the stranger in the night time, throwing us to the ground. When all we wanna do is get away. You are dark. You are dark.
Wow, I love that song. I love it. But I wonder what you make of it. I wonder how much it resonates with you or confuses you. Because, I mean, on one level, it turns on its head one of the most basic things that we're constantly taught about God. Instead of affirming that God is light, it says God is dark. And I wonder how that makes you feel. How does it make you feel to think of God in terms of dark or darkness rather than light? Not instead of, but how does it make us feel to think of God in terms of darkness? Well, look, I think that the song isn't attempting to make some abstract statement about the nature of God. Well, not in the obvious sense, anyway. I think its real intent is to protest against or subvert a particular approach to Christian spirituality, the kind of approach that that is that simplistic, know-it-all approach to faith that many of us have seen and probably been a part of, but maybe grown weary of. I think it's all summarized in that statement: "You are dark when all is bright." It's almost as if this is a sort of a protest against that kind of sweetness and light, that brightness approach to spirituality that seems to be telling us that we're supposed to be feeling upbeat and rejoicing and happy all the time. What I love about the song, is the way that its musical tone completely harmonizes with what the words are expressing. Its mournful quality, the melancholy of Luke's voice, is the antithesis of happy clappiness. The whole song together exudes a sense of yearning or longing, which is almost penitential, reaching for a different vision of God, of what it means to be a follower of God. To me, both the words and the music embody a similar spirit that breathes through that quote of Thomas Merton that I gave you, where he says, "I know nothing of you. By myself, I cannot even imagine you. If I imagine you, I'm mistaken. If I understand you, I'm deluded. If I'm conscious and certain that I know you, I'm crazy. The darkness is enough." Now, this is all of this is the opposite to the kind of know-it-all approach to faith that we find in many churches. You are the cloud of unknowing, when we know-it-alls know it all. It's a much more chastened attitude toward the knowledge of God, isn't it? It's more of an acknowledgement of what we don't know and maybe can't know than, singing happy jingles about what we do know. Is there joy in this? Is there joy in this form of spirituality? Well, I'd say absolutely yes. Just as I think that there is joy, potentially, in the darker times of life. But it's different, isn't it? It's different to bubbly happiness, which is also valid, by the way. I like a bit of bubbly happiness. Um, but what does it mean then? What does this joy in darkness look like? Well, before I kind of get too much into that, I'd like you to take a moment to just stop and think about Luke's song and what it says to you, or how you disagree with it, which of course is equally valid. So it'd be good if you could just take a moment to think about that. What was it that struck you from the song that really resonated? What were the things that grated, or what were the things that left you a bit confused? Now, if light and dark, exuberance and melancholy, triumphalism and contemplation represent different ends of a spectrum, I wonder what has been your experience of where the emphasis tends to lie in church circles or in approaches to Christian spirituality or worship that you've come across. And what are the consequences of that? Okay, well, let me tell you a story. It's a story about one of the most joyful people that I've ever known, but who, throughout all the time that I knew her, which was several years, she lived under the shadow of death, her own death. Her name's Julia, and sadly, she is no longer with us, but her memory will never leave us, me and Pat and lots of others who knew her, always bringing a smile to our faces and a sense of delighted gratitude that she was part of our lives when she comes to mind. Julia suffered from cancer for 12 years, during which time she had more operations than anyone could shake a stick at. No one thought that she would last anything like that length of time. However, eventually it was her turn. Everybody loved Julia. She didn't have a malicious bone in her body. I'm not saying she was perfect, because you know what? She'd come back to haunt me if I said that. But I would personally settle for being half as good as Julia was. I certainly feel I'm a better person for having known her. And Julia's lasting legacy to the St. Luke's community, where I was the vicar for 19 years, is a beautiful secluded garden which she created at the side of the building. The space had been basically a rubbish dump for years, the builder's yard for umpteen work projects on the building. But her vision for that small plot was infectious, and she organised work parties to clear the site and plant a magnificent assortment of plants and shrubs and a small lawn. You know, she was quite a frail looking person. She was quite, slim, not a big muscular sort of person, but she had this big presence, this big personality, and this infectiousness that inspired people to do what she wanted them to do. The garden's south facing, and with a couple of memorial benches that folk have donated for loved ones. It's somewhere that children can play after church, or where you can sit with a cup of tea or a mug of coffee peacefully. And we named it Julia's Garden. Julia's then husband, John, he's one of the most charming men that you will ever meet, with an extraordinary playful sense of humour. He's also a pretty vociferous atheist, though he certainly admired Julia's faith, and I reckon he's a lot more spiritual than he ever cares to admit. He's a thoroughly decent person. Anyway, what no one knew was that before she died, Julia booked a small ad in a Lonely Hearts column in a national newspaper for John to appear a couple of months after she died. I mean, can you believe that? John only discovered this that it was there when he got an email from the newspaper telling him that his ad was about to run in the paper. And well, it worked because through that ad, John met Ruth, to whom he is now married. Ironically, another deeply spiritual woman. She wasn't particularly religious in the formal sense, but a very spiritual woman who, through Julia's connection with St. Luke's Church, actually became a member of the church, and really found that as a way forward for her journey of faith. I mean, you just couldn't make this up, could you? What an amazing woman she was. For me, Julia throws a lot of light on the topic of finding joy in difficult times. In fact, when I think about joy, she is one of the first people to come to mind. So here's the way I see it. I think happiness is about a mood, okay, an emotional state based on events and circumstances. Joy, on the other hand, is the outcome of a choice, a stance taken in the face of circumstances, whether good or bad. I'm not, as I've said already, in any way diminishing happiness. I am essentially a happy person most of the time. But then I have a largely happy life, added to which I am an Enneagram Type 7, an epicure they call it, a lover of pleasure. And it's my default strategy in life to look on the bright side, to do whatever possible to keep things positive and upbeat. So yeah, if circumstances turn dark, my natural instinct is to put a gloss on them, maybe ignore them or shove them aside, maybe kind of gloss over them with a joke. That's my kind of Scouse Type 7 tendency, default tendency. Interestingly, if I applied the Enneagram to religious subcultures, I'd say that a lot of charismatic spirituality is kind of rooted in a Type 7 outlook. happy clappy, praise the Lord, come what may, reject all the darkness, that's of the devil, look up, keep trusting, have faith, reject negative thoughts and doubts, confess the truth of Christ's victory, all that kind of stuff. And there you go. I was a part of that. I was actually a leading figure in charismatic circles for 20 odd years. Um, and during that time, I came to see what it could do to people who refused to accept it, or who were just unable to live with that, who perhaps in Enneagram terms were type 4s, which is the most melancholic of all the personalities. But that's real. And in fact, the longing, the priority for type 4s is for emotional authenticity. And so it's little wonder that often I notice those kind of people, I didn't call them type, I didn't know that language at the time, but I noticed those kind of people struggling in what was basically a quite superficial praise the Lord kind of subculture, that basically these people would identify as being somewhat phony. And so I saw how all of these kind of people were pushed to the sides, or were treated as people who needed some kind of help or deliverance or whatever. It may sound strange to think of joy as a choice, but then I think joy is much more than an emotion. Happiness is an emotion. Joy is much more than an emotion. It's a state of being, I think, based on life choices and held in place by resilience. I was very helped in thinking about this by the writings of Viktor Frankl, Jewish psychotherapist and Holocaust survivor. Frankl relates how when he was in the concentration camp, he said there were always those people, there weren't many, but there were always those people who, even in that darkest of places, when they themselves were hungry, would go through the huts looking for the people who were hungrier than they were, and to give them their meagre rations. It was a choice. And reflecting on that, Viktor Frankl says, everything can be taken from a person. In whatever things in life, everything can be taken from a person except one thing. The last of human freedoms, he says. And that last thing that cannot be taken is the freedom to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Nowadays, we understand from neuroscience that choices repeatedly made have the power to rewire our brains, to reinforce things like the sort of resilience that Frankl speaks about, to choose joy as a way of looking at the world, a way of being in the world instead of sinking into despair, actually can be something that creates fresh neural pathways in the brain, so that becomes a natural response rather than something that we are kind of imposing upon ourselves. You may recall that I finished on Sunday by saying that I believe joy is the outcome of hope. Joy is the outcome of hope. And I went on to say that I define hope as defiant reimagination in the face of despair. Now, if that isn't what those people were doing in the huts in the concentration camp, then I don't know what is. They were living demonstrations, embodiments of hope as defiant reimagination in the face of despair. And I believe it's that defiance to reimagine which can embed itself in the very structures of our brain through practice. Through practice, creating new pathways in the mind for things like joy and resilience. The way I see it is, it's a bit like making a new path through some woods, where it's all undergrowth and it's all kind of covered over, and it's a job to see how to get through. But if we walk through that, and we walk through it the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day, eventually a new pathway is formed through the woods. And I think that's a way of seeing what neuroscientists speak of as being neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to reshape itself, to remold itself into patterns of thought that then become, the kind of natural way that we think. Developing spiritual or contemplative practices, I think, helps with this. And I like the word practices. It reminds me that life's greatest skills require constant rehearsal. We make mistakes, we screw up, we get it wrong, we forget, or we get distracted. But then we start again. And we become good at what we practice. If we practice things like, self-criticism, then we become Olympic champions at self-criticism. If we practice affirming hope and joy in ourselves, then I believe we can win gold medals in joy and hope as well. There are things in life that we can't change, certain circumstances, random events, the actions of others. And there are other things that we can change. And I've always loved the serenity prayer, that's used by Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs. And I don't see it just as a nice little prayer to say. I think of it as a spiritual mantra, as a practice to come back to all the time, to help reaffirm those new pathways that we wish to establish. It says, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And my experience pastorally is that many, many, many people's problems come from trying to change things they can't change and not changing things that they can. So that prayer isn't just a prayer, it's a practice for life. And early on in the lockdown, I wrote a new version of the Serenity Prayer, especially for the Holy Shed. And I commend it to you right now as I finish, not just for use through the pandemic, but as a mantra, as a practice that I believe can forge resilience in us. This is what it is. You might like to say it with me now. God, grant me the serenity to live fully and generously through circumstances I cannot control. Hope to keep on imagining better times for myself and the world. And courage to change what I can instead of simply leaving it to others. Amen. Well, I think that prayer is actually a recipe for joy, actually. And I think if we not just pray the prayer, but actually sort of embed it within ourselves, the spirit of it, then I think that is definitely opening up a doorway to a more joyful way of living. So I hope you have some fun chewing all this over. Hey, disagree with as much as you wish of what I've said, because as I often say, I'm not even sure I agree with everything I say, but at least use it as the basis to try and chew all this over and see what you think about it. Okay, and I'll be back with you soon. Bye.